Thank you all for coming to the September 5th public hearing council meeting. At this time, I ask that you would silence all your devices. And if for some reason you want to address the city council, we have some sign-up forms in the back of the room. And city manager, you did so well at the last meeting invocation. We're going to ask you to do it again.
Sure. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, again, we thank you for this opportunity to be here tonight, Lord. We pray that you'll give us wisdom as we do the business of the city. Lord, we pray for each and every one that is here, that you'll keep us safe traveling back and forth, and for those who couldn't be with us. Lord, we pray for wisdom. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you all. Before we begin the meeting, I do want to welcome a new individual to the meeting. Those that haven't met him yet, our new police chief is sitting right over there, Stephen McCosker, and welcome to your first city council meeting. We won't talk about how quickly he had to leap into action right after he was sworn in yesterday, but he's right on the spot. We have all city council members present, so we do have a quorum. Does anybody have any objections to tonight's agenda? Seeing none, the agenda is approved by unanimous consent. Easy for me to say, right? Yeah. Okay. Anybody from the public like to address anything tonight on the council agenda? Seeing nobody, we'll move right along. And we'll begin with the salary study, which will be presented by our city manager.
Yes, sir, Mr. Mayor and Council, the item that you have before you is a request for approval or acceptance of the salary study. If you remember, prior to the strategic planning meeting, I discussed with you a need to go through the process of having a study done. When we originally discussed it, it was my expectation that this process would be something we would hire out to an outside firm. Typically, they run anywhere between $30,000 and $50,000, and they usually take about 6 to 8 months. However, once we began to look at what we were actually trying to accomplish, and I sat down with our newly hired human resources specialist, it became obvious that this was something we could accomplish internally and do a non-biased assessment in that we have sought from all the surrounding jurisdictions what they're currently paying, and then took all that, compiled it together, and created an average of what the competitive wage is for each individual position here in the city. And what we did is, because every municipality and or local government, whether it's or utility provider, has its own little quirks in the types of titles that we use. We have some titles that aren't used anywhere else, and some of the things that we call individuals are not necessarily consistent with other jurisdictions' responsibility levels. Actually, what Jessica did is she met with the department heads as well to make sure that, specifically in fire is a good example, we have what we call captains, which in a lot of other areas are driver engineers. And so when we started to evaluate specifically what the duties were, we did an assessment based on the titles, and then we verified those titles against what their actual responsibilities were, and then we compiled all of the information together into a comprehensive study. So there were, we sought out multiple different jurisdictions and or utility service providers to accomplish this. Not every jurisdiction had every single position. And so what we did is we did it on an average basis. We also we looked closely at the places that we're losing people to. Because we wanted or that are beating us out when we're interviewing employees, and then we can't hire them because the coming on wage is not adequate. And so in doing that, what you'll find, if you would like, I can provide for you all the backup data. It's a spreadsheet that is about this wide if you print it, if you want to be able to read it. And it includes all these different jurisdictions at each different position level, what their actual minimum, because this all starts based on the minimum amount that they're paid for the position. And then it takes all of those that are applicable and then creates an average. And then from that average, we did we then sat down after she had worked with the specific department heads. She had questions about their duties. And then Jessica and I sat down, our human resources specialist and I sat down, and we looked at those specifically. And then I made some phone calls to some of the jurisdictions around us that had just completed salary studies as well, to try to look and see what they were looking at as they moved into the month of October. So because of how quickly we moved on the salary study, one of the things that we could have been faced with was the opportunity to adopt this study and find ourselves in October behind the ball. Because, for example, the city of Fort Walton Beach, Okaloosa County did a partial study, and some of the other jurisdictions around us did studies this summer. And so when they complete their studies, they get recommendations based on that. Some of them made adjustments mid-year. Fort Walton made mid-year adjustments. Some of them will make their adjustments in October. And so if we had just taken the information just from what their current rates were, we would have started out again in October behind. So what we did is we took those averages and then again reached back out, and I called some of the people that I've worked with in the past. We worked directly with some of the managers' offices and some of the human resource offices, so we could really get an idea of what their plans were going into the next fiscal year. As I mentioned during the strategic planning also, it was my goal to accomplish this inside of a 3-year window. I knew that it would be impossible for us, or I assumed it would be impossible for us to do a study and then bring every single individual in the city up to a competitive wage for their job based on their tenure all in 1 year, because it's a costly endeavor. And whenever we do something like that, we need to be measured in how we do it. And so during the workshop that we held for the budget, you all agreed to allow me to set aside about $500,000 for the implementation component of it. One of the questions I've got and some of the comments that I've seen is that we were going to spend $500,000 to do a study. That's not accurate. The $500,000 was to be distributed amongst the employees. So this is a reoccurring budget number that would be distributed across all of the employees to help to make the adjustments that were necessary to at least bring them up to the minimums for each individual category. And so what we found during the study, and all of this stuff is in the staff report, but what we found in the study is that there are 2 areas of the city where we really had some deficiencies. There were a smattering of positions throughout the city where the entry level pay was not adequate, but there were some areas where it was definitely low. And the 2 areas that primarily were affected by the study were the police department and the fire department. And what we found is not only at the entry level, because our entry level in both of those, so an incoming firefighter was competitive. We weren't on the top end, but we were competitive. And an incoming police officer was on the low end, but maybe we could convince them we're a better place to work. They weren't so far off. But where we found some of these discrepancies were in what is a lot of times referred to as that middle management category, or the succession planning. So like if you had in the police department our sergeants, the pay for our sergeants was not comparable to the pay for sergeants in other jurisdictions, and it wasn't even close. We have, at the city, we have majors that were at one time called commanders. And so when we looked at the pay discrepancies between that, and that's another position where we looked at, okay, what are their daily responsibilities, and we did a comparison based on that. And so a major at the city of Crestview does not have the same scope of responsibility that a major at the sheriff's department or with the highway patrol or somebody like that has. And so we took their scope of responsibility, and I met with Andrew and the guys actually while we were going through this process, and it was one of the things we talked about briefly, but we talked about it. And so we looked at those positions, but even in looking at them specifically on their responsibility, those positions were the ones where we saw the greatest amount of discrepancy. So what you find with that is you begin to create a culture where you are hiring people, preparing them, certifying them, training them, and sending them off somewhere else. Because if you know that you can come in the city of Crestview at a rate that is maybe comparative, but then when you get to be promoted to either a corporal or a sergeant or on up through the ranks to a major or a chief, but you know that you're not going to be competitive, why would you invest your life in that decision? As I explained to you during strategic planning, my goal is to create an environment where we hire people, where they come to work for us and they retire from here. We want employees that come and work for their whole career here. And we're going to raise the bar of expectations. And so in order to do that, we need to be making sure that we are able to competitively seek out our employees. And so we noticed that was happening. And there's a lot of reasons why that happens. Typically, though, in local government, what happens is that when someone has been here for 5 or more years, they've kind of crested the mountain of the pension. And so we offer a pension. And so once you've been here for more than 5 years, it gets a little bit harder to decide to walk away over a couple of bucks an hour. And so we found ourselves, more than likely, we found ourselves in a place where we couldn't recruit. So we continued to raise that bottom hiring level, but those that had been here for a longer period of time were not getting raises because they were going to stay anyway. We probably didn't sit in here and talk about that, but that's a lot of the times that's what happens, because we know that if somebody's in the pension, it's a lot harder to make that decision to leave. Well, that doesn't do anything for morale, and it doesn't do anything for creating an environment where we're going to get the best, the highest and the best out of each of our employees. So this study, what this study does is it looks at each of those individual positions, and it suggests adjusting that minimum paid amount for each of those positions based on the findings of that study. And to implement that, just to bring everyone up to the place where they were going to just make the minimum, to make us minimally competitive based on the average for the area, it did cost, the initial cost is right around $500,000. One of the things that we found, or that was developed as we began to apply this to each individual employee, is that when we talked to you originally, I wasn't sure how you would go. So when I brought the budget to you the first time, it showed the employee rates with the 3% that we had talked about. Everybody would get a minimum of 3%. And so there was, in the initial budget that was presented to you, actually about a little over almost $110,000 worth of additional revenue that gets recaptured inside the study. So when we made the adjustment for the study, some of that adjustment was already compensated for. So there actually was, we had set aside a number of $500,000. There was actually a little over $600,000 that was available to implement this study. Instead of going above what we had originally discussed, we kept the number at the 500. It's a little over 500, but we're implementing just that first step. And the additional $100,000, give or take, that was left over, we're then putting into the reserves for the city, so that next year when we sit down and talk, I haven't assigned that money to some other reoccurring cost I have to make it up for next year. So in essence, what that means is that builds up our reserve by right around $100,000, more than you had initially thought when we talked about the budget. And it also prepares me it puts me in a position to better take step 2 next year once you adopt this plan. And so before you have my request for you to adopt the plan as it is presented. In the attachments, it shows each and every position, what Crestview currently pays, what we're suggesting for title changes for some of these positions, and then what it shows what Crestview currently pays, where it says average, that's what the study results showed, and then my suggested rate is the suggested rate. And you'll see that in some of those areas that my suggested rate is more than the average. When you look at that, that's because of the conversations that I just had about, like, for example, police officers. Some of our competing jurisdictions are going to give their police officers a raise on 10-1. If I go with the suggested rate right now, the average rate, then I'm going to start out 10-1 behind the curve again. And so this gets us even with all of those. The study also shows you in the staff report, or the staff report also shows you the second and the third year implementation. So what happens when you perform a study like this is you create an issue that's called compression. And what compression is it's when the entry-level employees are either approaching in their pay or more importantly, more specifically in this plan, if you have an employee who's been in a position for a long period of time, say you've got and I'll use the police because they're easy. If you've got a sergeant that's been doing it for 7 years, and then you have a sergeant that's been doing it for 7 months, on 10-1, they're going to be making the same money. Because this study, the first phase of the study is to bring everybody up to the minimums. In year 2 of the study, what we determined through this process is we compared several jurisdictions and what they were doing for their compression implementation. And what we found is that most people were rewarding employees based on tenure. That's not necessarily my favorite option. I want to get us to the place as an organization where we reward people based on performance. But before we can get there, we have to establish benchmarks. So we have to say, If Mr. Hayes is an employee in the Public Services Department, when we sit down and do his evaluation, we'll give him goals for the upcoming year, and then he'll be evaluated based on the criteria inside the performance evaluation and those goals. And so when we get to the place where we're recognizing employees based on performance, he will have an opportunity to shine based on our expectations, a clear definition of what our expectations are. If we did it solely right now based on performance, it has the risk of being a popularity contest. So what we did do is we said for year 2 and year 3, we will give credit in the position that they've held in their current position up to 10 years at 1.5% per year for up to 10 years. And we would split that over a 2-year period. So they would get, the first 5 years of that 1.5 up to the first 5 years of the 1.5, the first year, and then anything beyond that they would get inside the second year. And so that takes that reoccurring impact and it spreads it out over 2 years instead of me trying to do all of that this year. What we're asking you to do tonight is to approve the study as it's been submitted to you, which will then establish the first year's implementation, which is already in the balanced budget that you have, and also to set those minimums and accept the new grade and step program that we've provided for you. Then you're conceptually accepting the plan. In other words, that if we can fund year 2 and year 3, then we'll go ahead and move forward with it. So when I sit down to do the budget next year with all of our department heads, we'll calculate what that impact will be each year, and we'll see it, we'll do our best to implement it. You're not guaranteeing the employees that they're going to get it next year because nobody knows what will happen with the market. If we fall into a recession, we'll all be dealing with a reverse on our ad valorem, and that's where we'll find ourselves in a different situation than we find ourselves today. If everything tracks on just the way that it is, just the natural progression of growth for the city of Crestview, we should be able to adopt year 2 and year 3. We should be able to absorb year 2 and year 3. That's why we did it this way. You're all aware of the jurisdiction I came from. Down there, one of the struggles was the rate of growth was not nearly what it is in Crestview. And so down there, they had to do it across a 5-year time period, and then you were taking away from different features in order to do that. I think we can do it here without having to do that as we continue to grow the way that we're growing, especially when we're issuing the number of permits and things that we're issuing each week, and all of the development that's coming down the pipe. So again, what I'm asking you to do today is to approve this study before we go in and approve the budget, since that's where it'll be implemented. And then I wanted to open it up to any questions that you might have. So at this time, I will do that.
Any questions, please come through me. Okay, Councilman Rancich.
I do have a question. So the suggested min is what is equaling out to the 500,000, correct?
Yeah, give or take
Give
a
or
little
take.
bit, yes, sir.
Okay.
It's what's in this year's budget.
Okay. I don't mean to blindside you with this, but I do.
But
see
you're going to.
But I'm going to. I do see some substantial adjustments. Now, we
Yes.
are not the tax preparers for our employees, but we need to ensure that if there are some adjustments that may put somebody in a bind because they're not used to that planning, that we need to identify those and at least,
Right, that's an excellent point. What we'll do, it's an excellent point I haven't thought of. So what I'll do is I will carry that to Jessica, our human resources specialist, and we've got an employee meeting coming up in October. And so as a part of that, we'll make sure that we have some accounting experts available to talk to them. We'll bring them in and do, that's good stuff though. I didn't even
yeah,
think
because
of
this
that.
is exactly what we need. I mean, we need to train our employees like they can leave, or,
Yep.
and we need to treat them like so they don't want to.
That's it.
So.
Yes, sir. Another thing to keep in mind too, while we look at these, at some of the ones that have substantial increases, I also want you to remember that everyone is faced with a 10% or a little over 10% increase in our health insurance as well. So the employees are having to absorb that at the same time. So when we get back to that question about should everybody have gotten, because the minimum anyone will get is 3%. And so they'll get, if they're already above the minimum the position should pay, they'll get a minimum of 3%. And then beyond that, if that 3% puts them still below the amount they should get, then they'll get the increase up to that base minimum amount. But everybody's still faced with the 10%, a little over 10% health insurance increase.
Other questions?
Yes, sir.
Councilman Hayes?
Not a question, but maybe a comment. Tim and I sit down and, because the ones that have been here before know how I felt about across the board things. And we had a talk, and he told me that, you know, implementation of one. First thing I asked him was, can we fund it? That was the first thing, you know, can we fund it? And he told me it was built in the budget, and I hadn't really, I guess I looked over that part, but I shouldn't have. So after our discussion, well, I knew it was right anyway. I always believe in treating employees as fairly as possible within our means. I would not want to work for a company that didn't look out for me. And we're a city, but we're a company too. And we have employees or stockholders, which are our citizens within our company. And they would, just like a stockholder would look out for the best for his company, we as elected officials have to try and look out the best for our company and especially our employees. So people know me for the last few years that I'm always in favor of the employees, as long as it's, we got the funds. And he explained to me about the 2 and the 3. If we got the funds there, we can push ahead. If we don't, we can just say we don't have the funds to do it this time, but later. So I'm all for this way, based on my conversation with him.
You know,
Councilwoman Brown?
you know, losing somebody in the middle management is really lost money all the way around. You have to start all over with somebody else. So in the long run, this is going to save the city money and also provide a better environment for our employees and for our citizens. We want to provide excellent municipal services, right?
That's it.
Yeah, so.
That's it.
That's where we're going.
One other comment, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, go ahead,
Um,
Councilman Hayes.
When you lose somebody, you gotta, especially within your safety department,
Yeah,
they're gonna come here to train some when you hire them. But you still gotta, it costs to replace
Yes.
people. I mean, you know, you just don't replace people walking in the door and say, here's your salary. There's a lot of things where to be trained, so I can't remember what it was when I was in retail, what it cost for me to train, get a new supervisor and the cost. Really, people look at it and say, it costs you that much? Yeah, it costs, but then you're looking for the best people you can find.
Right.
If you're looking for just anybody, well, I wouldn't even hire just anybody anyway, just like I'm sure he wouldn't either. So we're looking for the best that we can get. And the world is a competitive place with the employment rate around here in this county, you know, is less than 3%. Last time I heard it was 2.7, 2.8, you know, and people can find jobs almost anywhere if you have the skill level. So we want people to stay here. And another thing that we have to look at is our future with our young people. Because people, I left here when I finished high school to go to college because I knew I couldn't make the money for the life that I wanted to live. Just wasn't here, not for me. So I left, but I came back, and I'm glad I did. But hopefully, we'll look at this not only from this standpoint, but you know, we got generations. Hopefully, future generations. The way the world's going, I don't know, but we have to look out not only for this moment in time, but we got to look out for future times.
Any other comments, questions? Go ahead, Councilman Blocker.
I've been asked, Tim, since I talked to you the other day,
Yes, sir.
through your summary of your salary study, has there any of our current employees had a decrease in salary?
As a result of the study,
Yes.
no one will lose money. There are people that are above the average, but they
That's
don't
what I'm
lose
getting
money.
at.
No, sir, they do not lose money.
'Cause we had a whole controversy here a few years ago.
Right.
It got hot and heavy.
No, sir, no one will lose money in this. What will happen what could potentially happen, and I don't have any on the top of my head, but they may find themselves closer to the ceiling of their position.
by all
So
means.
if somebody's at the top end of what the new pay grade is, they may hit that ceiling in a couple of years or something like that, but nobody will lose money.
With this system that you're proposing, is it gonna sunset in 10 years?
No, actually, that's actually a good question. What we're gonna do with it is each year we'll evaluate the pay grades based on cost of living. So if I'm right now, which I believe we are, then next year the brackets themselves will move by the cost of living. So we've been throwing a 3% or whatever at them every year. What'll happen moving forward is whatever the actual cost of living is, the entire bracket will move. And then we'll talk about whatever adjustments the employees get beyond that. That way we don't leave our brackets behind, which could happen. And that happens in a lot of places. That happened at my last jurisdiction.
Thank you.
That's a good point.
That's all the comments. I would just like to finalize everything by saying, last couple of years, I've worked on making suggestions how we can take care of our people. But the thing that always kicked me was the compression issue,
Yes, sir.
and I couldn't figure that out. That's why we hired you.
Or Jessica, actually.
Yeah,
Jessica
okay.
did all the
but,
work.
So we will be able to handle that down the road. So it sounds to me like you brought us a good plan.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna call for action from the council then.
Mr. President,
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Blocker.
I make a motion that the council approve the pay study as part of the 2019-2020 budget.
Second.
I have a motion second for the council to approve the pay study as part of the 2019-2020 budget. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries 5-0. And now we're gonna move on to resolution 19-25.
You want to read it?
Madam Clerk?
Resolution 1925 reads by title, a resolution of the City of Crestview of Okaloosa County, Florida, adopting the tentative levying of a millage of 6.9466 for the fiscal year beginning October 1st, 2019, and ending September 30th, 2020, providing for an effective date. This is Resolution 1925.
Mr. Mayor and Council, this, as I explained to you during the strategic planning and during the budget process, we have not raised the millage rate or suggested to do that. We're requesting that you'll approve the millage rate at what it was previously, and so that's the resolution that you have before you. I'll take any questions you might have.
Been through this during the budget hearing, so any further questions or comments?
I have just one comment.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Hayes.
I'm glad that our city manager made a comment on Facebook explaining this to our citizens. Because someone thought we had raised, somebody stated that we had raised our millage rate, and you know how Facebook blows up. But he really explained it to them that we were still at the same, and based on your property values, might have went up or might have went out. That would be the increase, but not from the city. So I appreciate that explanation provided to the citizens.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. At this time, a call for action, please.
Move to adopt resolution 1925, adopting a tentative millage rate at 6.9466 for the fiscal year 2020.
Second.
I have a motion second to adopt the resolution 19-25, the tentative millage rate of 6.9466 for the fiscal year 2020. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries 5-0. And now, resolution 19-26, Madam Clerk.
Resolution 19-26 reads by title, a resolution of the City of Crestview of Okaloosa County, Florida, adopting the tentative budget for the fiscal year beginning October 1st, 2019, and ending September 30th, 2020, providing for an effective date. This is Resolution 1926.
Mr. Mayor and Council, this is the resolution adopting the tentative millage. The tentative budget. There are very few changes to this budget from the budget hearing. Those changes are directed specifically to projects we either will accomplish or have not accomplished. And as we get closer to the final adoption, we'll fine tune the numbers, and that's it. But there's been no substantial changes to this at all. I will ask, Mr. Mayor, that once this is done, I would also request that as a separate motion that we would approve that the council would approve my appointment as Barry Henderson to our Community Development Services Director's position. I always forget that the charter requires that you guys confirm it. That is how this budget is established. And by doing that, in order to make this budget, we eliminated a position and saved about a little over $100,000. Through there, we eliminated positions in that department, saving a little over $100,000 of tax dollars. So if we don't approve that, then I have to come up with a new plan. So first motion we're looking for is approval of the budget, and the second one would be approval of my appointment for Mr. Henderson, unless you have any questions.
And what position was that?
Community Development Services Director. Used to be Growth Management.
Any questions for the city manager on the budget? Action, please.
Mr. President,
Go ahead, Ms. Blocker.
make a motion that the council adopts resolution 19-26, adopting the tentative budget of 342.756 for the year of 2020.
Second.
Okay,
You want me to give it to you in a
well,
minute?
no, but I think the points is a little
The points
confusing.
might be in the wrong
Yeah.
place.
Just-
The-
we just need
The
to-
comma makes it 36 million, the points
Yeah.
leads a little confusion, I think.
I want you to figure it out.
I can figure it out, $36,342,756, but,
That's it.
okay.
And
That's-
56 cents.
That's the motion,
Yeah.
okay.
I second the motion.
Motion has been seconded to adopt resolution 19-26, adopting the tentative budget of $36,342,756 for the fiscal year 2020. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries 5-0. Now, you're gonna have to whip that other one on me again there, because,
Yes, sir.
I can probably carry that one if needed.
you state it, buddy, and we'll follow.
Okay, I make motion to appoint Barry Henderson as Community Director Services.
Community Development Services.
Community Development.
Thought you had it, huh?
I thought he had it, he wrote it, he thought he had it.
Community Development Services.
Confirm my appointment.
Okay, we have motion second to appoint Barry Henderson
Confirm my appointment so that it's.
to confirm the appointment of Barry Henderson to the Community Development Services Director.
Yes, as of
Okay.
10/1.
Any further discussion? Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, I mean, excuse me.
Who seconded that?
Me.
Okay, Ms. Brown.
Not in there.
All
Thank
those
you all.
opposed? Motion carries 5-0.
We'll do this one more time and it'll be for real.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes,
Can-
Councilman Hayes.
Can we give him a short title? Barry?
Keep him short of title.
Yeah.
CDS Director.
That'll work, that'll work.
Okay, all right, let's get back on focus here, guys. We got another meeting coming up. Anybody from the audience like to say anything to anybody up here for any reason? Seeing none. Thing was not moving. That's all right. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.